what Mike was saying, bourbon cannot have any flavors added. That's why this is not considered a bourbon. You cannot add any additional flavors. So since this does have the added flavors in there, it can no longer be a bourbon, which is why it's its own category. Welcome back to another Thursday episode from your boys at the Buffalo Happy Hour, and today we have another educational video for you to understand what is in front of us right now and what makes it all different.
There's too many options on the shelf, Derek, which having options is great, but if you can dwindle it down to basically what you want and then where you can find it, then you alleviate a lot of the stress.
And in liquor stores, they have everything separated basically by the kinds that we have here. So if you understand what we're talking about here, which is going to be probably as quickly as we can, like succinct, then you'll be able to understand where in the liquor store you need to look to find your preferred spirit.
Which you can do at our sponsor at Addie's.
Addie's Fine Wine and Spirits. They have been a sponsor of our show for a little bit now, and they are basically the best liquor store in the entire world. I'm going to go out there on a limb and say it. They're just the nicest people. They really don't look at how they can make the most profit off of their product. They're trying to help the community understand different spirits and different wines, which is why they have an insane collection of whiskey, a great selection of all the other spirits as well, and also a ton of wine with an in-house wine sommelier. So if you want any of these options, some of them might be available, some of them might not, but that doesn't mean they can't get it for you. You can just ask them. But if you are going to look for any of these, download the Addie's Wine and Spirits app on your Android or your Apple phone and search anything that we talk about today, because chances are they'll have it, and if not, they will be able to tell you what is similar to what we talked about here today.
So we'll start very broad. Whiskey or whiskey? Now, if there's an E or if there's no E, most people are confused, don't understand why. The easiest way to explain that is where it's made. Right, Derek?
Correct. They're both right. Whiskey without the E, whiskey with the E, they're both grammatically correct. It just depends on where it's coming from. Whiskey without the E comes from Scotland for the most part, or Scottish countries that follow the Scottish way of distilling. And whiskey with an E are primarily North America, USA, and then also Ireland doesn't use it, or uses an E too, right? Yeah, uses an E too. Mm-hmm. Nailed it.
There it is. So hopefully that answers some of your questions. But now what we'll dive into is some of the options in front of us, what makes it what it is in regards to the name, and then hopefully this helps you just kind of generally understand. We're not going to dive too much into the weeds on it, but we just want to kind of give you guys a quick synopsis so that if you're in a liquor store, then you can at least better articulate what you're trying to purchase to then allow the staff to better assist you.
Yeah, and if any of these interest you here and you want us to go in more in-depth on any of them, leave a comment down below specifically what one really intrigues you, and we can do an entire episode dedicated to that. But this is really 30,000-foot view, high level.
Irish whiskey, we'll start there. So generally, Irish whiskey has a smoother flavor than the other types of whiskey. It's made from a mash of malt, and that can only be distilled using water and caramel coloring. Must be distilled in a wooden cask for at least 3 years, and the result is a whiskey that's easy to sip neat or on the rocks. Though, you can use Irish whiskey to make cocktails as well, which, to be fair, you can for essentially every single thing in front of us right now, specifically once we get towards the end. But that's Irish whiskey in a whole.
Yeah. They don't use peat, which is going to kind of segue into our next one. The biggest differentiator between this next one and Irish whiskey is the use of peat moss.
That's it. So our next one is Scotch. So most people assimilate the no E, like we said before, to a Scotch, which, yes, absolutely, like we said before, based on where it's made. So with Scotch, what you're getting is, like Derek said, the introduction of peat, which is going to bring up that peaty, mossy, earthy campfire smoke tasting profiles into the product. So initially, it's a huge turnoff for whiskey drinkers, but that's basically the main difference between Irish and Scotch whiskey.
And the biggest thing with both of these is understanding which one you would want to start with, because starting is going to be your gateway into trying everything, and there's a huge amount of whiskey in both of these categories. So choose your first one wisely and make sure it is one that is easy for you to transition into.
Now, there's laws that Scotch has to follow, and of course there's laws essentially that every whiskey has to follow, but for Scotch specifically, the main ticket items is that the distillers have to follow these, and that's why you'll always see Scotch with an age preference on it. The reason being is the spirit must age in an oak barrel for at least 3 years, plus each bottle must have an age statement which reflects the youngest age whiskey used to make that blend. Pause. I just want that to sink in. It's a whiskey to sip neat, and it makes an excellent after-dinner drink. This is something that you commonly see in like gentlemen's clubs or, circles of men around a fire, or those like super high-end Godfather type movies. Everybody's generally drinking Scotch and having a cigar. It's just that kind of a mystique about it, and it's an upper level type of spirit.
Yeah, and we'll tell you too which one's our favorite here. For me, Scotch is my favorite out of all of these because of the different tasting profiles you can get throughout the entire country of Scotland.
Yes, which leads us into our next, which we're going to jump to the other side of the pond. So Japanese whiskey.
The pond.
The pond. Now, Japanese whiskey is relatively new. They specifically just developed a new set of laws that they have to follow as well. And with Japanese whiskey, what you're getting is almost similar to Irish whiskey, except it's primarily rice.
Well,
in the fact that it's smoother.
Yeah, it's actually similar to Scotch, which is why they don't use the E. They use the same distillation process as Scotland does, and they like to blend a lot of Scotches before they came up with the legal definition of it. So you'll see Japanese whiskeys do not use the E because they kind of mirror more of what Scotland does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was saying from a tasting profile standpoint, it's smoother than a Scotch. But they, like Derek said, they use the same type of properties. But, so I'm trying to round it out so we don't get too deep into it, but it was created to taste as close to Scotch, like you said, and then it's primarily used in mixed drinks, which I think we both really struggle with because we do everything neat. So there's go-tos for cocktails, but for us, if you're willing to try Japanese whiskey, I would try it neat just because they did put a lot of time into making it, and then that way you can kind of formulate your own opinions on if you like the actual tasting profile of it or not, and then if you don't, then you might be able to hide it and kind of incorporate it into a cocktail. But that's Japanese whiskey. Canadian whiskey. Now we're really jumping across the pond. So like Scotch, again, Canadian whiskey must be barrel-aged for at least 3 years. It's lighter and smoother than other types of whiskey because it contains a high percentage of corn. You'll find that most Canadian whiskeys are made from corn and rye, but other may feature wheat or barley. And that's just basically the type of grains that are used to make up the actual spirit that you're, in the end, going to consume.
Some Canadian whiskeys that you probably know are Crown Royal. That's probably the most prevalent one. There's a lot of other Canadian rye whiskeys like Alberta. We don't have anything here in front of us right now because it's Canada. But if you do want to try it, definitely have an open mind. They kind of do the same thing with where they try to mirror Scotland, which is why they also do not have an E in there as well.
So now we'll just jump across Lake Erie and enjoy the fact that we, as a country of the United States of America, have a drink. And the American spirit is bourbon, which by our law has to be made within the United States to then earn the title of bourbon. So bourbon is a American-style whiskey. It's made from corn. In fact, to be called bourbon, the spirit needs to be made from at least 51% corn, aged in a new oak barrel, and produced in the U.S. It has no minimum aging period and needs to be bottled at 80 proof or more. So in that, bourbon offers a lot of complexities that you're going to pick up. Different states make different kinds of bourbons. Most commonly consumed, I guess, I was going to say drunken, but that's definitely not correct, is bourbon from Kentucky. Most people understand that that's where bourbon's from, and then most people want to try that because that's where it's from. Other states have now, because of an amendment to the Constitution, are able to make bourbon. They're making fantastic spirits that are worth trying. We've reviewed a multitude of them on our show over the last 100 whiskey reviews that we've completed. But in that, you're going to be enjoying America's spirit, and you really can't go wrong either way.
Yeah, Kentucky bourbon to us is pretty similar. So if you are going to be drinking bourbon, we do recommend maybe going outside of Kentucky. Alabama has some good ones. Wyoming has some good ones. Even New York now has some very good bourbons.
And
so
Texas.
if you are going to try some different bourbons, we do recommend starting outside of Kentucky because you can go down a rabbit hole of Kentucky distilleries that taste the same.
Absolutely. Which leads us into another state, which is Tennessee whiskey. Now, Tennessee whiskey has its own specific type, very similar to Kentucky and New York, because of its filtration process called the Lincoln County process. Derek, do you want to expand on what exactly the Lincoln County process is?
Yeah, so the Lincoln County process is a process to filter out your whiskey when you dump it from the barrel into basically where you're going to bottle it from, and that is a maple charcoal process. Now, this is specific to Tennessee. No other state does this, and that's what makes this Tennessee whiskey. Technically, considering the mash bill, it is considered a bourbon, but since it is made in Tennessee with this Lincoln County process, they can call this a Tennessee whiskey and be basically their own category because of it.
So your most common brands are going to be Jack Daniels and then essentially
George Dickel,
but anything Jack Daniels, you're just going to assimilate that to Tennessee and the Lincoln County process. They're just the biggest brand, and they just kind of own it. Rye whiskey is next. So rye whiskey is very similar to what we were discussing about the mash with bourbon, except with rye, it has to be a primary grain inside of the mash bill. Generally, what you'll see on the shelf is a 95.5. In New York, there are distilleries that make 100% rye whiskey, or 100% rye mash bill whiskeys, and in that, it's basically drinking bread and a back end kick of pepper. A lot of people like that. A lot of people start with rye or the opposite, right? There's other people that start with bourbon and then work their way into a rye. So it's all depending on what your tasting profiles are as soon as you start enjoying spirits, but that is rye whiskey. Rye whiskey is made in the United States as well as Canada.
Yeah, there's a subset, which we're not going to go into too much, but New York now has their own category of rye called Empire Rye, which means that all of the rye grains and the whole distilling process was completed within New York. This is something that you could potentially see as bourbon industry grows, as each state having their own categorization of what whiskey they like to produce. Rye can be made anywhere, but Empire Rye can only be made in New York.
So that leads us into one of our last categories, which is blended whiskey. Man, this is a loaded topic, so we'll try to keep it as simple as possible. What we have in front of us is Devil's River bourbon coffee. Or coffee bourbon. So in that, what it is it's primarily bourbon first, and then they have coffee blended into it so that you're getting those tasting notes and tasting profiles incorporated. Now, because it has that incorporation, they legally can't really call it bourbon anymore.
Correct.
So that's where it gets a little tricky, but blended whiskeys as a whole are great for cocktails. It's a mixture of different types of whiskeys generally, as well as colorings, flavorings, and even grains. So with that, you're going to make awesome cocktails, so keep that in mind with a blended whiskey.
Yeah, I would prefer using a blended whiskey in a cocktail over a vodka or gin to get those awesome flavors. Right now we have coffee bourbon in front of us just because we both love coffee and we love Devil's River, but you can get, even Cask and Crew has like a ginger spice, an orange peel, a walnut toffee, different types of flavors in your whiskey that can elevate your cocktail game to that next level. Now, like what Mike was saying, bourbon cannot have any flavors added. That's why this is not considered a bourbon. You cannot add any additional flavors. So since this does have the added flavors in there, it can no longer be a bourbon, which is why it's its own category.
Perfect thing for newbies inside of a liquor store as well. This generally has a lower price point, anywhere from $20 to $30 per bottle for 750 milliliters.
And it can get you into whiskey.
Absolutely. Which leads us into our last category, which is a single malt. So again, we can dive into this for 3 days because single malts are not only incredible, but they're very in-depth. So do you want to give the specifics behind what makes a single malt a single malt?
So single malt just means that it is one malt coming from one distillery. Yep. You get that quite a bit when it comes down to scotches. You have Irish single malts. You can basically now have any country's single malt as long as they're following that recipe formula. America just kind of started getting into the game here, where you have like Balcones single malt, you have single malts coming out of other parts of New York that are trying to mimic Scotland as much as possible, but the whole single malt term just means that entire mash bill process. It has to be one grain coming from one distillery. What's cool, again, about single malt is you can have it from any country.
Yeah.
France is starting just making their own. Israel, we had an Israel single malt on the podcast not too long ago. Japanese, there's so many different countries that are now getting into whiskey, and they're categorizing themselves as country single malt, which is going to be a cool evolution as whiskey continues to grow throughout other countries.
So hopefully this helps you. Or if any of these you want us to specifically dive into, we can do a whole episode on just that. So if you want to learn more about a single malt, if you want to learn more about a blended, or if you want to learn more about the Lincoln County process, we can specifically hammer those topics for you in its own video. Just let us know in the comments below, and we appreciate any and all support that you guys are giving us, because it just allows us the opportunity to make more content.
And today we just reviewed our 100th whiskey. So next week we're going to be looking at our top whiskeys that we reviewed this year throughout 2021. Mike and I are going to rate our top 5. So if that's something you're interested in, please tune in next week. Any of these options you can probably find at Addie's Wine and Liquor. Again, download their app and then you can search anything. If they don't have, let's say, Lagavulin Nick Offerman edition, you can always search a different Isla Scotch. So they can help you with that if you do want to try a specific kind of whiskey. They'll direct you into the right place, and we always recommend them because they're a great liquor store.
And then if you are within New York State, they can ship spirits to you. So just keep that in mind. You can just buy it on their app and they'll ship it right out via UPS. So
if you are going to try any of these, we do highly recommend you always drink responsibly, be a good person, and Michael,
do not litter.
We're out.